I review a lot of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition modules on this channel because, of course, this is a review channel, so it is what I do. But a question I get asked a lot from my viewers is, Mr. T, a great review and all, but that module you're reviewing, for what level of players is the module written and how can I scale it to suit my players? So here are my top 3 tips for scaling combat encounters and scaling entire Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition modules. So the way I see it, there are actually 3 ways for me to scale combat encounters and entire modules for your players. The first one is the most used one, and it is what I call the mechanical scaling of a combat encounter or a module. And it is literally what it says it is, and that's just using the stats of a trap or a monster or an encounter and just adjusting the stats to suit a higher or a lower level party of players. Then the second one is what I like to call the content scaling, and it is actually adjusting the content of an adventure module in a way that your players will have a harder or a maybe an easier time to actually go through the module. So for example, maybe adding something in, doubling something, or taking something out. I will get to it in a minute. And the third one is what I like to call changing stuff up, scaling on the fly. And that's the most difficult one because you don't want your players to actually notice you're scaling stuff on the fly. But it's also the most fun one and the most rewarding one, knowing just that you just decreased something with 1 point and that just made this player do something very awesome, which is actually the most rewarding part of scaling combat encounters. Very quickly, before I get into the first one, which is the mechanical part of scaling combat encounters, I just want to say that I still have a t-shirt shop over on Spreadshirt.com. You can click it in the description below, and I have actually every playable class. Well, I'm adding every playable class in t-shirt form. I've just added the Rogue to it. I also have the Bard, I have the Barbarian, I have the Cleric, and I of course have my favorite class, the Fighter. But eventually I want to have every character class in there, so you can all sit around the table and wear a t-shirt of your favorite class. I'm very happy with these shirts. If you decide to buy one and support me by doing so, make sure to comment below saying that you're buying one, because I want to be the one to personally thank you for it. Quick shout out to Mrs. T for helping me creating these t-shirts. They're all my idea, but she actually designs them because I have zero talent. So, mechanically scaling combat encounters, and I just want to get it out there that I am not the number crunching type of dungeon masters. The way I scale combat encounters, there's 2 very important things when I scale a creature down or up. So let's talk about down just for a minute. Scaling a creature down, there's 2 very important things for me at least, and the most important thing is actually armor class. Armor class in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition does not scale that much as, for example, in 4th edition. In 4th edition you could have like 35 and maybe 40 armor class or something, I don't know. But in 5th edition, having 15 armor class is kind of okay. Having 20 is like wowsy, and having 22 or 23 is like, and there's even players that can go up a little more with like spells like shield and stuff like that. Anyway, 1 point of armor class in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is kinda a lot. 2 points of armor class is very, 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 very much. So that means that if you only deduct 1 armor class from a bunch of creatures that have, for example, 13 armor class, and your players are level 3, I don't know, and these creatures have 13 armor class, and you just deduct 1 point from that, and they all have 12 armor class, I mean, there's going to be a lot more hits during an encounter. For example, small story, I had this awesome encounter with my players a few weeks ago, where my players were sailing a boat through a desert. Yes, there was a desert. There is a desert that has such loose sand that there's actually boats sailing through it. And they entered a vortex. So they had to do skill checks. The captain had to do skill checks to keep the boat out of this vortex. So they had to keep their speed up so they could sail out of this vortex. But at the same time, this big ass dragon showed up, and the dragon's tactic actually was to slow the boat so the boat would go into the vortex, and then the dragon could just pick out everybody and eat everybody. So what the dragon did was try to put its feet or its hands or its feet against the ship and just push it back to make sure it slowed down, and at the same time use its breath weapon, bite to everybody it could reach. So there was this gigantic battle going on of this 5-player group on a ship, and they were all trying to haze the sails and help steer the ship, and also at the same time try to kill a dragon. But this dragon I used was actually a dragon from the Tome of Beasts or the Creature Codex. It was a Wasteland Dragon or something like that. Actually, I just deducted 1 point from its armor class, and just to test it out, I kept track of the amount of hits that it took because of me deducting this 1 point. And this creature got hit 4 times, and there is a paladin in the player, so the paladin got a chance to smite it. There was a rogue in the player who got a chance to extra sneak attack damage. I mean, 4 hits more in an entire encounter in a boss fight can really change things up. I just kept track of every time they rolled a 17 and not an 18, and it was 4 times. So in other words, scaling the armor class is the first thing I always do. The second thing I do when I scale down or up a creature is, of course, its hit points. And scaling down and up its hit points is the most easy thing. Well, there's a lot of math involved if you want to do it official and you want to do it right, but it's actually very easy because you can just lie about it. For example, there is a Ancient Black Dragon in the Monsters Manual which has 22 armor class and it has 367 hit points. Yes, I've just looked that up. That's a good thing about not doing live videos. I jumped out of here, I jumped back in here, I looked it up. It has 367 hit points. There's nothing that stops you from it having 300 hit points, and there's nothing that stops you from deducting 2 from its armor class. Now, if you have a Ancient Black Dragon that only has 20 armor class, which is way easier to hit, and you deduct 67 from its hit points, which makes 300, it will be a way easier creature. But the thing is, if your players in the first 3 to 4 rounds do 250 damage to this creature, there's nothing that stops you. Nothing that actually stops you from it having 367 hit points. It's just its original hit points because your players do not know how many hit points this creature has. Also, there's nothing from just keeping the fight on until it drops to 400 hit points and you just say you killed the creature and you do it at 400 hit points because your players do not know how many hit points this creature has. Now, there's a lot of official ways to actually precisely calculate the challenge rating of creatures when you deduct hit points, when you add or deduct armor class. But the thing is, for me personally, I think you just need to learn that on the fly as a Dungeon Master, because you'll get experience as a Dungeon Master and you will just start to feel and you get to know your players, and you just know if they're well rested, my players will do like a gazillion damage in the first round, and if they're not rested at all, they will not do a lot of damage. Other things you can do to scale down an encounter, and that's of course if your players are fighting against dragons that do breath weapons, or they're fighting against spellcasters that actually cast spells where you have to roll a saving throw, or traps where you have to roll a saving throw. Saving throws are kind of the same as armor class in a way that it doesn't scale that much. Having something that has a saving throw of 17 or 18 is already, it's quite high of a saving throw. So you know that maybe one of your players will succeed and the entire party will succeed and the other people will take full damage. But if you have a saving throw of 13, 14, maybe 15, it gets a lot easier. And most of the time, if I have a saving throw of 14, I noticed that about half my party, and there's 5 of them, so half doesn't really exist, so 2 or 3 people actually save and 2 or 3 people actually fail the saving throw. So saving throws of a breath weapon, scale it down, scale it 1, but just be very gentle, be very careful with it. Also, if your dragon, for example, does 66 fire damage or 68 fire damage, just deduct some of those d6s, make it 5d6, maybe even 4d6, or use the same amount of dice, because rolling a shit ton of dice is amazing, and just make the die lower. So a D8 becomes a D6, or a D8 becomes a D10 if you're scaling it up. Stuff like that, it's very easy. I know I'm rambling right now, it is just how I scale encounters. I go about it very loosely. I just put the armor class lower, I just put the hit points lower, maybe one of the saving throws a bit lower, and I just go with the flow, and if it doesn't work out during the battle, I can always adjust while we're fighting. By the way, hit points of monsters are calculated by its hit die times its level plus its constitution modifiers times its level. Anyway, if you want to deduct one level of hit points from a monster, just deduct the average roll of one of its hit die plus its constitution modifier once. If we deduct its constitution modifier and the average roll of one of its hit die, you add that together, deduct that from its total hit points, and you deducted one level of hit points from the creature. Second thing is what I like to call content scaling, and it is actually a lot of fun. Let's take for example the Shadows of the Duskreen. Let's take for example you are playing Shadows of the Duskreen for a level 6 party. Shadows of the Duskreen is written for a level 8 party. I've run it for a level 6 party, but the thing I did is in Shadows of the Duskreen your players have to collect 5 shards of a magical mirror in a forest, and there are of course 5 shards, so there's 5 encounters. Well, there's 3 encounters and there's 2 potential encounters in this module. So what I did with these 2 potential encounters, these encounters were so written that they could be role-playing encounters, but they could also be combat encounters depending on what the players did and said to the creatures they encountered. But what I did to create this module for a level 6 party was just have those 2 encounters not be combat encounters. Easy as that. I just made sure that these 2 encounters would end up in role-playing encounters and not in combat encounters. Of course, there could always be that one player that messes up entirely and does something very, very stupid, but insert actions and consequences of Dungeons and Dragons into that, and you will just have to murder the party or something, because that's actions and consequences for you. That's just the way it works. But I, as a dungeon master, did everything I could to just make those encounters be role-playing encounters. It's just a very fun way of using the material you have in front of you and not really having to adjust the entire story, having to adjust the entire content, and still create and still have the players feel that they played the same module, but they just did it in a very slightly different way as other players who finished that module. So the third thing I do to scale combat encounters is the on-the-fly scaling of combat encounters. And this is the most fun one for me, because this one turns Dungeons and Dragons into a game for the Dungeon Master. So if I can, as a Dungeon Master, get to play around with the difficulty of a combat encounter, it becomes a game within a game for me. For example, the most obvious thing you can do, and it is also a little bit mechanically scaling, everything is actually a little bit mechanically scaling, but the most obvious thing you can do is turn a 5-goblin party into a 7-goblin party, or a 3-goblin party, because that's just the easiest thing, but I don't know if it's even worth saying here, because everybody knows that you can just add in more enemies or deduct enemies to make something harder or to make something easier. But something I, for example, like to do, and I did a few weeks ago, I had a party of mine encounter, I think were 7 goblins, and I just knew this party was going to wreck the hell out of these goblins. But instead of turning these 7 into like 10 or 12 goblins, I decided to turn these goblins into a sort of organized, as far as goblins can be organized militia. And they actually, I gave them pack tactics, which made the encounter way more difficult, because my players went in this fight thinking 7 goblins, easy as heck. So one of my players got surrounded by like 4 of these goblins, and they were all able to roll with advantage because of this pack tactics. So before they started hitting down a few of these goblins, they were really taking a punch, and one of the players actually went down to the floor and had to roll death saving throws. He ended up making it, because I don't really like to kill players with goblins. Well, I like killing players with goblins a lot. Anyway, The encounter went way harder than my players actually expected. My players wouldn't have fought these goblins with the same kind of confidence because there was like 12 of them, but now there were like 7 of them and they were like, we're going to kill the heck out of these goblins, but they had pack tactics, so surprise there! Also something I do, which I said in the beginning of this video, is of course adding hit points on the fly and deducting hit points on the fly. Be very careful with that, because if you kill players because of you adding hit points to a dragon in the middle of an encounter, some players don't really like being killed by a creature that should have been down like 3 rounds ago, so be very, very, very careful with that. Make it like 1 in 10 encounters where you sometimes it's just like 10 hit points, maybe 12 hit points. Or something I like to do with hit points is, let's say for example, a giant has 40 hit points left and this rogue comes in from nowhere and he shoots 1 arrow, sneaks attack 1 arrow into the face of this giant and does 39 points of damage. Just make this giant die. This 1 point of HP will not make any difference because the next guy will just hit the giant. But just make this an epic moment. It's that kind of stuff that makes Dungeons and Dragons, and is the difference between Dungeons and Dragons playing a tabletop RPG and playing a computer game. I know this was just me rambling about how I scale combat encounters and adventure modules. I added a poll to this video somewhere here. You can click it and you can actually answer the question, do you like these kinds of off-the-cuff unscripted videos of me rambling about IDs? Yes, there are a million other ways to scale encounters, but these are just my loose IDs that I was spitting to you guys. Just answer my poll because I really want to know what you guys want from me and this channel in the future. Anyway, I hope I was able to help even a few dungeon masters who maybe just started out dungeon mastering or whatever, or maybe you just like watching me sitting in front of a wall and talk about Dungeons and Dragons. This is a fake wall, by the way. Anyway, I hope your inspiration may guide you.